What's up, you guys? Welcome to another video. Today we're talking about developing dynamic control. So the first question we want to ask is, what is dynamic in itself, right? And then what is dynamic control? And then once we understand that, we can talk about how do we develop it? How do we acquire it? How do we use it, right? So the first thing we want to talk about is what dynamics is. Dynamics is the option or the difference between going soft and going really loud and intense. It's really more so related to volume in terms of your playing or the output of something. Is it soft, is it quiet, or is it loud and intense, right? And then control of that is, how do we know when to use it? How do we know when to play soft, and how do we know when to play loud, right? So the first thing we want to talk about is our ghost notes. If you don't know what a ghost note is, for me, a ghost note is something that for the most part is going to land on that E and or it's going to land on the in-between note of your downbeat, right? And I'll give you an example. So the first thing we're going to talk about is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Really not that complicated, just a simple 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? Nothing forward, nothing crazy to it, simple eighth note, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? 16th note, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a, right? And then you could end on 1. So the first thing we want to talk about is a ghost note, and the ghost note is the soft note that we're playing in between our heavy downstroke, which is our downbeat, right? We're going to start off with the eighth note, 1 and. So you can see on the 1, which is my downbeat, which is going to have a more of an accent, a higher, more intensity when I strike the thing, that is going to be our downbeat. That's going to be our downbeat. The note after that, which is going to be our ghost note, that's the first thing we want to focus on, is whatever we're playing, the groove, what does it require? Does it require an eighth note? You know, does it require a 16th note? Does it need to sound a little bit busier, right? When you play an eighth note, when you play a 16th note, that's the first thing you're going to notice is it sounds busier. And some songs require that 16th note, you know? And so you got to find out, when do you play an eighth note, when do you play a 16th note? And the difference between those is going to be your ghost notes, right? Is do you have, and you can add an accent on there. We're not even talking about adding an accent on the and or you can do that. That's a whole nother lesson for itself. Right now we're just starting off with what is the basic 16th note and what is the basic eighth note. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, when do we use that? And so if you're playing an eighth note and you're playing a 16th note, right, or you're playing a quarter note, when do we use particular ghost notes? So the second thing we want to talk about is, from our ghost note, is really our control, is our stick height, right? Is how high do we play these stick heights, right? Are we playing, and I'll give you an example too, are we playing 1 and 2 and, right, with a higher stick count, a higher stick? Or are we playing it lower, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? I can play a little train, chugga 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 chugga, and I'm playing it really soft. There's a little bit of an accent. But if I want to play it a little bit more intense, right? So you can see that I've raised the tip of my stick. The first thing I'm focusing on is my tip of my stick. Is it going to be a little high? Or is it going to be a lot high? Big difference in the intensity and the softness of what we're playing. The second thing we want to talk about in our stick height is how intense we play the stick height, right? How intense we strike the pad, or we strike the cymbal, or we strike the tom. Whatever we're playing, whatever we're focusing on is not just how high we're playing it, but how intense are we playing it, right? And another thing you can notice, if I'm playing, I could play up here with the very little, or I could play it up here with more intensity, right? So you can hear the difference. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is feel, right? Is how do you feel it when you're playing? You want to listen to the music. We're not just playing to, you know, a track, or we're playing to, sometimes you're recording and you are playing to a track, but if you're playing live, which is what I'm referring to, you want to think about the room. You want to think about the audience, you know. You want to think about how does this sound when you're playing to the room or you're playing to the audience. You know, you want to, for me, I like to play to the guy at the back of the room. And so if you sit up front, if you go to a concert and you sit right in front of those subwoofers, you're gonna get blasted a lot more as if you're a guy in the stand in that 300 section, you know. And that's the same thing no matter any venue you go to, right? So you can't just play to the person on the front row. You got to think about the person at the very end in the back of the room, the person on the second story, the person on the third story of the tier, you know, and how are they gonna hear that sound, right? Granted, you have mics and you have an audio team that can do that, but you want to think about that when you're playing. You're not just playing, you know, to yourself. You're playing to the room. And that relates into the feel of how we're playing in terms of the stick height and the intensity of our stick height, right? And all of that combined is going to give us the control that we're looking for. So when we're talking about dynamic control, first off, what is dynamic, right? It's the option of playing soft or playing loud, like I was saying, right? And the control is when do we play that, depending on the song, right? And then the second thing is how do we play that, and again, when do we play that, depending on the audience, depending on the room, depending on the song. A certain part of the song might require you to play a 16th note, and it might require you to have a more intensity, busier feel, right? And another part of the song might not require that. It might require you to be soft. It actually might require you to not play at all, you know. And then you might notice that in some different venues, you might play the song differently from, like I say, a small bar versus if you're playing an amphitheater, right? Or if you're playing a stadium. You're gonna notice how you play the song different, how you perform the song different, you know. The size of the stage that you're playing, that is gonna have an effect as well, you know, on how do you control the dynamic that you're trying to put out. So I think the thing we're trying to talk about today is not just what is dynamic, but having dynamic control and how to use it and when to use it. So I hope this helps you guys. See you guys on the next video.